in my Toolbox import files folder, we have the meteorological data file, and it's a text file because it has the extension of .txt. So let's just open it and take a quick look at it. So this is how our file looks. I'm going to start the process of importing that file into Toolbox. So I'm going to close that file for now and go back into Toolbox. And remember, when we work on importing a file into the Toolbox, we use the continuous or meteorological data fast track. So we click on that option. We click on the first one, which is data inflow, which is where you do all of your routine importing and entry of QC data into the Toolbox. So we click on data inflow, and then we click on the bottom one, which is the import raw data file from sampler button. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and that opens the first form in the series of data import forms. And you'll notice that this is the same form we worked from when we imported our continuous data into the Toolbox. So our continuous pollutant data works from the same first form as with meteorological data. One thing to remember is for meteorological data, we go through the same process. So the data move through a pipeline of tables. So the first table is the data import table. The second table is the verification table where you do some flagging of your data. And then the third table is the archive table, which is the permanent home of the data. So for meteorological data, it's a different table. So there's a meteorological data archive table and a pollutant concentration archive table. So it's the same process. It just lives in two different tables, but they're both archive tables. They're step by step. So we have step B, step C, and each of those steps have a section in the help file or the SOP if you get stuck on a particular step. So remember, this was a text file. So we're going to click on the import text file button, and you can either click on the little radio button or you can actually click on the button itself. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that import text file button, and that opens up the navigation screen of where you need to tell the Toolbox where is your file that you want to import into the Toolbox located. So my particular file is located on my desktop in a folder that's called Toolbox Import Files. So I open that up, and you'll see that I've got two files that are text files in that folder. I've got my ozone file and my MET file. Remember, we already imported our ozone file, and we're working on meteorological data during this module. So we're going to click on the meteorological file and click open. And that doesn't open the file, but it tells the Toolbox that's the file we want to import into the Toolbox. So we click open, and we get the import successful box, which is good, and we say okay. And now we can move on to the next step, which is inspecting the data that we just imported. And remember what I told you last week, that when you inspect the table, the data import table is very similar to the actual file that you imported. So it's going to look very much like the file you imported because that's the initial step. So let's take a look at that file or that table. And it's just your data in a table format. So we need to scroll through the data and make sure that you don't see anything strange about the data. And by anything strange, I mean perhaps blank rows, any weird characters, etc. And we also need to check at the very bottom of the screen here that the number of records in the file matches what we wrote down in our database logbook for the file. So it says there's 336 records, and that matches what's in my database logbook. So we are good to go with that. I can close this screen by clicking on the lower X button. And we're ready to move on to the next form in the series. So when we click on the Continue to Transfer to Verification Table Form button, what we're doing is we're telling the Toolbox we did everything we needed to do on this form, and we are ready to go to the next form in the series. So that's going to close down this form and open the next one in the series. So in this form, we are going to transfer the data from our import table into our verification table. That's the main purpose of this form. So what we need to do first is complete step D, which is entering the site ID and sampler ID. So my meteorological sampler is located at my imaginary site S46. And when I click on that, the sampler ID box populated. And I want to select my meteorological data sampler, and that's INMET. So I select that. And now we move on to step E, which is what I call the field mapping step. And remember what I mentioned during the last module is that this is probably the most complicated step in the series because we need to tell the toolbox what the columns in our data import table mean, because the column names are usually different between the import table and the verification table. So we need to map those correctly. So we'll click on the step E and set up that transfer to verification table. When you first import a meteorological file for the first time into the toolbox, this is going to be a blank query, and we need to work on getting these columns up here into this area down here. So in this particular example, there's multiple ways of getting those columns into this area. And in this particular example, I'm going to copy all of the columns. So I'm going to click to do that. I'm going to click on the first column, and that's the time column in this particular example. And then I'm going to hold down my shift key on my keyboard, and I'm going to click on the last field, and that's the battery voltage field. And that's going to highlight all of these fields. And it's going to make it so I can drag those fields into this area here. So I'm going to hold down the shift key and click battery voltage. And that highlights all of those fields. It might be in your particular meteorological data import table that you have lots of fields, and you might need to use the vertical scroll bar if it goes off the bottom of the screen here. And in that case, there'll be a little scroll bar here that you can use to find the last field. So now I need to click and drag these columns into this first area right here. So I got to click and drag. So I hold down my mouse, and then I let it go right here. And then those columns are now in this area here where we want to do the mapping. So remember that if the append to row is blank, that means we need to assign what column to map to in the verification table. So what happens here is the toolbox made a guess because the time has the same column name in the data import table as in the verification table. And remember, whenever the toolbox makes this kind of guess, you need to check that it guessed correctly. So it's saying that the time is going to the time column. So the time should only contain times in your import file. So let's take a look at that. So back in the import file, let's take a look and see if our times only contain time. So here is the time. And remember, it's a comma delimited file. So that means that it's separated by commas. Each column is separated by a comma. And so we'll notice here that the date and the time are not separated by a comma. So that means that the date and the time are actually in the same column. So the toolbox made an incorrect guess here because we can't import both a date and a time into the time field. So we need to correct that. So let's go back in Toolbox, and we need to change the append to row from time to something else that has both the date and the time. So let's scroll through and see what we got here. So we've got date, time. So that's what you need to map to if your date and time are in the same column. So we need to map this to date time and not time. Now that's mapped correctly, but the append to row is still blank for each of these parameters. So we need to assign what field in the verification table these parameters need to go into. So wind speed, let's click on the drop-down for the append to row and find the wind speed. The wind speed's right here. And precipitation, we do the same thing. We click in the append to row to get that drop-down arrow. Precipitation. There's precipitation. Percent relative humidity. There's relative humidity. And temperature. Temperature is ambient temperature in the verification table. And then we've got this battery voltage field. Now, if we scroll through the available columns in the verification table, we look through this, and I am not seeing anything that resembles a battery voltage. So that means that the toolbox doesn't have a field in the verification table for a battery voltage. So in that case, we can leave this append to row blank, and that data won't be copied from the import table into the verification table. So if that's the case, you just leave this blank and then doesn't copy that data into verification table. So now that we have mapped everything, we want to save this query. So to save the query, we use this little tiny icon that looks like a floppy disk, and we click Save. And now we can click on the lower X to close that field mapping query. And remember, next time I import my meteorological data file into the toolbox, this is all going to be saved for me. So I don't need to do this field mapping step every time. I only need to do it at the beginning of the process when I import my first meteorological data file into the toolbox, or if something has significantly changed about the format of your data, like your field names change in your import file, then you'd have to do some remapping of the columns. Okay, so I'll close this screen and move on to step F. So what we did so far is we just mapped the fields. We haven't actually copied the data. We just told the toolbox where those columns go. So step F actually copies the data from the import table to the verification table. So let's click on step F. And it says, I'm about to run an append query. And whenever the toolbox says it's about to run a query, you just say yes. And then that next box is what you want to pay attention to, because the next box tells you how many records are being copied into the verification table. And you want to confirm that that's the same number that's in your database logbook. So 336 rows is what I expect. That's what's written in my database logbook. So I say yes. And we can move on to step G, which is the Inspect Data Verification Table button. So let's take a look at how that data look in the verification table. So here's my data. And right now there's a bunch of blank fields at the beginning. So the toolbox is going to work on filling these in as we work through the steps on this form. But we want to make sure that the actual columns that we map to are populated. So we mapped to the date time field, that's populated, relative humidity, wind speed, ambient temperature, and precipitation. So let's scroll through the data and make sure it looks good and there's nothing strange about the data. And it's like I don't see any blank rows. I don't see any weird characters that would indicate something went wrong during the transfer of the data. And I confirm that there's 336 records in the verification table, and that matches what's in my database logbook. So we're good to go with that. We can close this window by clicking on the lower X button. And now we move on to step H, and that's the Update Site and Sampler ID button. So clicking on that button populates the site ID and the sampler ID in the verification table, and it runs some other populations in that table as well. So definitely want to click on that H button. And it says I'm about to run the update query, which is what I want. So I say yes. And I'm about to update 336 rows, which matches what's in my database logbook. And I say yes. So we move on to step I, which is viewing dates and times. And the main reason this is here is to make sure the start dates and time and the end dates and time matches what's in your database logbook. So let's click on that. And we look at the start date and start time. So 8/8 at 8 a.m., that matches what's in my logbook. And if I scroll down to the very bottom, let's see if the end date matches what's in my database logbook. So 8/22 at 7 a.m. matches what's in my database logbook. So you'll also notice that these fields are starting to get populated by the toolbox. So before these start date and times weren't populated, and now they are. So we can close this window by clicking on the lower X button. And we can move on to step J. Remember, step J is potentially something that you have to click on, but not necessarily something you have to click on. Remember, it depends on whether your data logger logs the start time or the end time. And just a refresher on what that means. So if your data logger logs a time of 9, and that's the start time, then that means that the sampler ran from 9 to 10, and that particular concentration or meteorological data is from the 9 to 10 period. If your data logger is logging the end times instead, that means 9 o'clock would have represented the period from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock instead. So the toolbox assumes that your data is being logged as a start time unless you tell it otherwise. So if your times are actually end times, you need to click on this button. And in most cases that we have seen, the data loggers and the analyzers usually log the start times. However, it is a good idea to check in your manuals for your data logger or your analyzer to make sure that you're actually logging the start time. In my meteorological data that's from my imaginary sampler, my data is logged as the start time, and I don't need to click on this button, but that doesn't mean that if you guys collect meteorological data, all meteorological data are logged as start times. Make sure you check your analyzer manual or your data logger manual. So I am going to write down in my database logbook that for my meteorological data, I need to skip step J. And then I can move on to the last buttons here, which is to continue to import and qualify pollutant concentrations or continue to import and qualify meteorological data. So remember, when we imported our pollutant concentrations last week, we clicked on this first button. But now we are working with meteorological data, so we are going to click on this next button, and we're going to open the form that moves the data from the verification table to the archive table for meteorological data. And we will open up the form to archive our meteorological data. So the setup is the same as the pollutant setup. First you update your units, and then you run your flagging, and then you move it to the archive table. So the first thing we need to do is we need to assign our meteorological data units. And I am going to consult my logbook because I don't remember exactly what those were, and I want to get those right for sure. So I have a wind speed of miles per hour, so I click on miles per hour in the wind speed box. I don't do barometric pressure. My precipitation data is in inches. I don't do dew point. My ambient temperature is in degrees Fahrenheit, and I don't do internal temperature, and I don't collect solar radiation. If you accidentally messed up something here and you selected the wrong units, you could clear all your selections by clicking on this gray button. I'm going to double check that mine are correct, and they match my database logbook, so I'm good to go. And I click on the K button, which is the update units. So this moves those units into the verification table. And it says I'm going to do an update query, and I say yes. And it says 336 rows, which matches what's in my database logbook. So I say yes again. And now we are going to move on to the flagging step, or the qualifying step. Remember, I use qualifying and flagging interchangeably. So this step is divided into two substeps for meteorological data. So we have step L1, which deals with ranges. So it does some checks based on ranges. And then we have step L2, which allows you to qualify additional data based on external information, such as perhaps a field logbook, or you have some sort of audit or something that you want to flag additional data for. So let's start with the range checks. So there's a lot of buttons here, and I am a little confused by all these buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the SOP. So I'm going to click here for the help file to open up the SOP. So what is all these buttons, and what do they do? In the SOP, we're at the very top of the SOP, and we can see this table of contents, and we can click on step L1 and go to that section of the SOP. So I'm going to do that and go directly to that section of the SOP. And let's take a look at this so we can read this. And if we look down here, it says there are two ways to check for data within the acceptable ranges. So you can either do it individually for each meteorological parameter, or you can do it all at one time. So you can evaluate all of the meteorological parameters at one time. So that is why there are all these different buttons. So that makes sense. And since I like to keep really detailed notes, I'm going to do it individually, because then I can see for each parameter which ones are out of range. So I'm going to do it individually by clicking on each of the individual buttons. So some of these are grayed out, and the reasons they're grayed out is because in my particular file, I don't collect these. So I don't collect wind direction, internal temperature, barometric pressure, etc. I only collect these ones that are not grayed out. So the ranges, these are the defaults that the Toolbox uses, and you can change these to ranges that are more relevant to your data. And the question is, can you know what ranges you used in the past? The answer is not, unless you wrote it down in your database logbook. That's something that you have to write down in order to know what ranges you used. Because what happens is every time you close out of this form, these go back to the defaults. So that's something that you should write down in your logbook about what ranges you used in the past. I'm going to change some of these ranges because these are not really relevant to my data. So for relative humidity, the range of 0 to 100 is expected, so I'm not going to change anything about that. For wind speed, I've got 0 to 999 miles per hour. That's way too much wind. We never get that much wind, so I'm going to change this to 100 miles per hour. And my ambient temperature, it never really gets that cold here. -40 is really cold. And we don't ever go below 0 at this particular imaginary site. So I'm going to enter 0. And precipitation, 999 inches in an hour. That's a lot of rain. We never get above 4 inches in an hour. So I'm going to change that to 4. And then I'm going to write that down in my database logbook that I changed the ranges from 0 to 100 for relative humidity, for wind speed, 0 to 100 miles per hour, ambient temperature 0 to 120, and precipitation 0 to 4 inches. So now we can go through each of these and look at data that are out of these ranges. So let's look. Display out of range data for relative humidity. Let's see if anything is out of range for relative humidity. So when I click on that button, I get a message box saying that there's not any relative humidity values outside the range specified. So I say, okay. And in that case, there's nothing to flag, so I wouldn't click on this qualify these data button. If I accidentally clicked on it it'd be okay. It would just say the same thing. There are not any relative humidity values outside the range specified. So I say okay, and we move on to wind speed. So let's see if there's any wind speed values that are out of range. And now instead of a message box, I'm actually getting some values here. So these values are out of range for wind speed. Looks like some sort of error code, -999. So I definitely need to flag those. So to flag them with the toolbox, I close this window by clicking on the lower X. And I click on the Qualify These Data button. And I get this message box that's saying, this step will qualify all of the out-of-range wind speed data. However, this does not exclude the data from AQS. Please be sure to also complete the final validation step to exclude data from AQS in future calculations. So remember that when you flag data or when you qualify data, you are not invalidating the data. So the data would still be submitted to AQS and the toolbox would still use that data in its calculations unless you invalidate the data. So it's always good to flag data, and then it's just telling you that that data needs to be further evaluated to decide whether or not you should invalidate that data. So that is just giving you a little warning, and it's going to give you that every time you flag data, just to remind you to complete the final data validation step. Okay, so I say okay, and it says I'm going to run an update query. I say yes, and I'm about to update 4 rows. I write down in my database logbook that I flagged 4 wind speed records that were out of the range of 0 to 100 miles per hour, and I say yes. Okay, so we move on to ambient temperature. Now let's look at the out-of-range data. And now we see we have 4 ambient temperatures that are really, 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 really warm. So this is not an earthly temperature. I mean, maybe it's something on a different planet, but not this planet. So we know these are errors and we want to flag them. Notice that we already have some flags in here, and that is our wind speed flag. For your meteorological data, each parameter has its own flag. So you definitely want to add the flag for your ambient temperature data, because this only applies to wind speed. If there's any questions on what these qualifiers mean, on the last page of the SOP for final data validation, there is a table that tells you what each of the toolbox flags mean. So if you looked at that table, you'd see OWS, and you'd see that means that the wind speed was out of range. So we can close this query by clicking on the lower X. And now we need to flag our ambient temperature data. So let's go ahead and flag those data by clicking on this button that says Qualify These Data. And it gives me that little message again that says, make sure you do the validation step. I say, okay, I will. And then it says, I'm going to run an update query. I say yes. I'm going to update 4 rows. I say yes. So now we're down to precipitation. Let's see if there's any precipitation values that are out of this range. And I get the message box that says there's not any precipitation values outside the range. Okay. So I don't need to click on that qualify button. And now we're done flagging data based on data values. Our data ranges, I should say. So the next part where we could flag additional data is if we had something in our logbook that said that the data should be flagged, or if we had some sort of audit or other reasons that we wanted to flag data. So I look at my field logbook and there's nothing in it that's unusual. So there's nothing that I need to flag additionally. But if there was, we could use this step to do that. So since there's nothing more to flag, we can move on to step M, which is transferring the data to the archive table. So the first thing you want to do is inspect the data. So we're going to click on the Inspect Data Verification Table button and make sure that the data is ready to move to its permanent home in the archive table. So here's how the data look in the verification table now, and you'll see the toolbox filled in all of these fields for us. The year, the Julian date, those are not filled in. because our data was not in serial data format. Pollutant code's not filled in because we're not importing pollutant data. Same thing with concentration and units. And let's just scroll through the data and make sure it looks good. So here are the data that we qualified. Notice that now we have the outer range wind speed, and we also have an OAT, which means outer range ambient temperature data. If you scroll right, you can see that there's the ambient temperature and there's the precipitation data. Let's just scroll through that as well and make sure it all looks good. Okay, it looks good to me. We're ready to close by clicking on that lower X button. So we'll close the verification table by clicking on the lower X, and we will move on to transferring that data from the verification table to the archive table. So this is going to move or copy the data from verification to the archive. So let's click on that button, and it's going to run a append query. I say yes, and 336 rows matches what's in my database logbook. So I say yes, and now the data are in their permanent home in the archive table. So let's click on the Inspect Data Archive Table button and take a look at that data in its permanent home. And remember what I said, there's two different archive tables. There's an archive table for pollutant data, and there's an archive table for MET data. So the only import we see right now is the MET data that we just imported. But as this grows, you're going to see every meteorological import that you've ever archived. So this table is going to grow and grow and grow. So this numbers at the very bottom is going to grow bigger with every import that you do into the toolbox. So it all looks good to me. So it looks like the archive was successful. So I can close the archive table by clicking on the lower X button. And now what steps we need to do is the steps to clear out the pipeline for our next import of data. So the first step in clearing out that pipeline is to clear the data verification table. So let's click on that and clear out our verification table. And it says I'm going to run a delete query, and that's good because I want to get the data out of the verification table because I've already archived that data and I don't need it in the verification table anymore. So I say yes. And 336 rows is what I want. It matches my logbook, and I say yes. Now you have three options here, and these options all clear out the data import table, but it just depends on if you're done working on imports for now or if you want to do another import. So if you had more data that you wanted to import that was in the same import file, you would click on the second button here, or if you had data that you wanted to import that was in a different import file, you could click on that bottom button. But we are done importing data for now into the toolbox, so we would use the top button, which is the Close Forms and Clear Data Import Table button. I'm going to click on that. And it says, I'm about to delete the data import table. Is that what you want me to do? And I say, yeah, I've archived that data. Go for it. Clear it out for my next import. So I say, okay. And that takes me back to the fast track form of the toolbox. And that completes our meteorological data imports.